This is Angel Miller with The Spiritual Survival, and inspired by my conversation a few weeks back with author Aki Cederberg, I've decided to do a regular series of interviews with important authors in the world of esotericism, martial arts, and self-development more broadly. And a couple of people I can tell you that we definitely will be interviewing are Don Webb, who's an occult author, especially in the world of the left-hand path, and Richard Kaczynski, who's an expert and a scholar on Aleister Crowley and the Ordo Templi Orientis, which one YouTube commenter was actually asking me about, so hopefully he'll get some answers there. You can find the interviews posted on the regular YouTube Spiritual Survival channel, and I'll also be posting these on Spotify as well. The YouTube channel will also continue to include videos by me talking about different spiritual subjects, whereas the Spotify channel won't. So you might want to check out one or the other. Tonight we're going to be speaking with Tor Apollonius, the Grand Commander of the Aesthetic Rose+Croix Order of the Temple and the Graal, which is a lesser-known Rosicrucian order which goes back to Péladan, who lived and was active during the latter half of the 19th century and the first couple of decades of the 20th century. So it has a fair history behind it. I hope you enjoy the interview and those interviews to come. Thanks very much. Tor Apollonius, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. Now, you're the Grand Commander of the Aesthetic Rose+Croix Order of the Temple and the Graal. And we're going to be discussing the history of the order and what it is exactly. But in brief, it's an initiatic order with a special emphasis that we'll get into within the Rosicrucian and sort of esoteric Christianity spectrum, let's say.
That's correct. I think in addition to esoteric Christianity, I would emphasize Hermeticism, alchemy, Kabbalah. We have a particular inspiration from the aesthetic of the Eleusinian tradition and Orphic tradition.
Right. Okay, great. So perhaps you could just, first of all, just give us a little bit of your background and how you became involved in the order and related orders, and just your personal journey in esotericism.
Sure. My original involvement was with the Gnostic Church, l'Église Gnostique Apostolique, and that was with the church in North America. And soon after that, I became involved with the Martinist order, the ancient Martinist order that had just come together in the year 2000 in Evansville, Indiana. And out of that group of individuals who were operating the Gnostic Church, the Martinist order, there was also a Rosicrucian order of the Temple and the Graal. At that point, this group was operating a number of the related esoteric orders that usually come under the parasol of the bishops of the Gnostic Church, those being Martinism, Rosicrucianism, and Masonic orders such as the Memphis Mizraim. And I became involved with that group of individuals. And the person who was the Grand Master of the ancient Martinist order at the time, John Cole, and also he was the head of the Blue Lodges of Memphis Mizraim, auxiliary bishop of the Gnostic Church for the Midwest, and the Grand Commander of the Rosicrucian Order of the Temple and the Graal. And so that was my initial involvement with these groups in 2000. Over the years, as I became more involved, the generation of individuals who were leading those orders passed away, unfortunately, and I became more involved toward the end of some of their tenures, closer to 2015. And as we were approaching a synod of the Gnostic Church in 2017, the Guggenheim Museum in New York City was offering the salons of the Rose+Croix, many of the original artworks that had appeared in Péladan's salons. And so we thought that the perfect opportunity to revive the aesthetic mission of the Rosicrucian order, taking the lineages that we had and emphasizing the aesthetic tradition as Péladan did.
Right. Because the Aesthetic Rose+Croix is more involved in art and music and so on, as I understand it.
Yes, and this was my own particular emphasis, and maybe what led me mostly to putting some of my energies into reviving or restoring that emphasis within the Rosicrucian tradition that we already held, because my own background was in both biology and music.
Okay.
And I took a particular interest in the aesthetic power of music and how it relates to biomusicology and the way in which we experience art and inspiration. So through that, I had long taken a deep interest in ancient Greek religion and the figure of Orpheus, who Péladan emphasizes very much in Delville and their artwork. And that I think led very naturally to this being an area of emphasis for me personally.
Right. And so you mentioned a few different orders that come together in your lineage, and also the figure of Péladan. And maybe we should just mention, because you mentioned the Martinists and the Rosicrucians and the Rite of Memphis and Mizraim. And perhaps you could just, first of all, just explain a little bit about what they are and the differences between them.
Well, I think there are many people who would say that Martinism is a permutation of sorts of Rosicrucianism. There are people who perhaps would say that Masonry has some vestiges of Rosicrucian philosophy and tradition within it. Even people who would say that the revival of the Gnostic Church in the 1880s, 1890s was something that before what they called the restoration of the Gnosis was that there were Gnostic traditions being promoted and preserved through Rosicrucians over the ages.
Right.
And so in a way, while many people may see these as separate orders, and we do maintain their separateness in the sense that we are not syncretic with their rituals as often has taken the place throughout the 20th century, we try to distinguish between the traditions. However, I think that they are all the same family.
Right.
And within the tradition itself, this is always how they have been viewed. They are sovereign orders in and of themselves, but all under the same umbrella and the protection of the same individuals, typically.
Yeah. And Memphis and Mizraim, you were mentioning Masonry, and that's considered to be, I believe, an irregular Masonic rite in the U.S. So not very many Freemasons would join that at all.
In the U.S., that's correct.
Yeah, and from what I've seen of the Memphis and Mizraim, it seems to be very influenced by sort of the Christian mysticism of Rosicrucianism, which itself was influenced by Hermeticism and ancient Greek mythology and thought. And it seems to be very influenced by alchemy as well, from what I have seen, which kind of ties it to the other orders in a certain respects. But how do all these things coalesce? Because it seems like you have a few different streams, Christian mysticism, ancient Greek thought, alchemy, Hermeticism, and so on.
I suppose the common thread that unites them all is a sense of pursuing philosophy or wisdom traditions in general, being instructed, in other words, by the book of nature rather than dogma or doctrine. This certainly is a line that goes through all of these traditions. I I also believe that the development of chivalry or virtue is as a code of conduct and as a way of living is something that typifies all of these groups. And then, of course, theurgy, or the regular praise and glory of God through ritual. I think that these three things, the philosophy or wisdom, virtue and chivalry, and theurgy, are what actually unite all of these traditions, and then they have their various emphases. So Memphis and Mizraim, typically in a Memphis and Mizraim lodge, you're going to have an Egyptian aesthetic and Hermetic aesthetic. Early in the Rose+Croix Kabbalistique of Pappus, de Guaita, and Péladan, you're going to have the Kabbalistic emphasis. In the Gnostic Church, you're going to be emphasizing the early Gnostic mysteries. So they all sort of are not literally the same individuals and same ideas, but many overlap. And I would say within the tradition or family, there is an inner consistency among them.
Yeah. And you mentioned Péladan and Pappus, and perhaps you could just explain who they are and why they're important, and how they link to these different traditions.
Well, Pappus, Dr. Gerard and Quoi, was a very well-known occultist in the French occult revival and was the founder of the Martinist order. He seemed to have a particular mission to collect many of the esoteric teachings that were around at the time and to preserve them. And he is the one who essentially took the initiation that existed among many people who had received or who were said to have received the initiation, l'initiation of Louis Claude de Saint Martin, and created that into an order. This was someone who was very central to the occult tradition, and he also, by the way, was a physician and the head of the hypnosis department of the Hospital of Charity in France, and so I believe in Lyon. And so not just an occultist, but also a physician and healer who had studied under the famous Master Philippe. And then you have who was a humble butcher, but also a profoundly respected healer. Then you had Péladan, who was quite a different personality. And I'm no historical expert on these personalities, but what I do understand is that Péladan is an art critic and writer, and he was a playwright and an author. Péladan was quite a personality, and he was, in many ways, people sort of attacked his personality, but I think that Péladan was emphasizing that a personality can be sort of like the kernel that the pearl forms around. A personality itself can be like Pappus or Péladan or any of these figures that we discuss, can be a central figure around whom ideas and other people coalesce. They had their falling out when they were in the Rose+Croix Kabbalistique, the OKRC, together. As Péladan believed that Pappus was too much into magic and occultism, and Pappus believed that Péladan was too much into the Roman Catholic Church.
Right.
Was the basis of their falling out, essentially, from what I understand. And so this is one of the interesting things, perhaps, and maybe even seemingly contradictory to the outside, of having an order such as the modern Aesthetic Rosicrucian Order that combines really the lineages of Pappus and Péladan, because initiatically we possess we possess both. We're probably a little bit closer to the lineage of Papists than we are to that of Péladan, directly through Papist's son, Philippe and Cos. Hopefully, in a way, we are maybe we're bringing them back together in harmony.
Right. Yeah, and so how have these orders developed over the last decade or so? You mentioned the exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum, I think it was, about a decade ago, which had the many of the paintings from Péladan's Rose+Croix salon in Paris. And what is the order doing today?
Well, since 2017, when the Synod of the Gnostic Church made the decision to authorize the reformation of the order, and I should be specific about this, what makes a chivalric order actually a chivalric order is that it is consecrated by a bishop. And so the primate of the Gnostic Church, with the authorization of the Synod of the Gnostic Church, consecrated, or I should say, consecrated the Aesthetic Rosicrucian Order. And there in the salons, we actually signed the foundation document of the order on the anniversary of the same date that Péladan formed his order on August 23rd. And since then, the order has expanded into 13 countries, including the United States, U.S., Canada, Brazil, Mexico in this hemisphere, and then in Europe, France, Germany, Spain, UK, Sweden. We even have groups or I should say some are groups, some are individuals in Philippines, Israel, Korea, Nigeria. So we have had quite a bit of interest, and I usually that the people who are interested, they find our order because they do have that particular love of the aesthetic mission.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a spiritual and esoteric order that's emphasizing music and art and so on. So what is the role of the aesthetic in spiritual development, and maybe in culture more broadly even?
Maybe I need to understand the question a little bit better.
Oh, sure. Yeah, so the Aesthetic Rose+Croix combines spiritual transcendence or spiritual development with art and music and so on. But is there a purpose to music and art beyond being merely aesthetic? Does it have a function?
I would say that we see art and music as the handmaiden of Gnosis, and this is one of the mottos that we have adopted for the Aesthetic Rose+Croix, that art is the handmaiden of Gnosis. In other words, that art and music, the inspiration that we receive, is a direct way of experiencing nature, of experiencing the order that exists within nature. It is a way of elevating a man. And while we say that, as a scientific order, because the Rosicrucian order is not just what I would call a spiritual order, but we are a philosophical order. We're a scientific order studying nature. And so, to the point of the aesthetic, we take a particular interest in how we experience art, how we experience the sensations of inspiration. For example, I won't go on too long of a tangent about this, but there are truly fascinating studies in terms of how we unconsciously experience pitch relationships, dynamics, and how we have a pre-conscious experience with these even when we are in the womb. And so we have a particular interest in studying the experience of art and how that elevates us. And I would say, perhaps less specifically to biomusicology, we acknowledge that there is something that is unspoken that you can only experience as inspiration, art, and that has a way of putting us directly in touch with the divine.
Right. And so art is the handmaiden of gnosis, and gnosis being a kind of transcendent experience that puts you in touch with God or the divine and so on.
Yes, yes, I would agree with that. And here I think it may be important to define gnosis originally simply as knowledge, in the true original sense of the word in ancient Greek. But as gnosis has come to be known over the ages among early Gnostics and in modern Gnosticism, yes, we would see gnosis as a revelatory experience or a transcendent experience.
Right. So not necessarily rational knowledge drawn from a book, but more experiential.
Yes, very much in line with what Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin might have called the gnosis cardias, or the knowledge of the heart.
Okay. Yeah, so that reminds me a little bit of Sufism with the way of the heart.
Yes.
Yeah. And so once someone is in the Aesthetic Order of the Rose+Croix, what kind of things would someone experience? Would there be practices or rituals, or are you devoting yourself to art, or what is it, or what potentially could it be for someone?
Our primary work is, as I mentioned earlier, is wisdom. So there is study,
right?
The individual member participates in primarily on their own, and we as a group are here to help and to guide and give resources. The chivalric development, or just the individual's self-development of virtue, which is a constant process of self-examination. And to this point, one of our regular practices in the Aesthetic Rose+Croix Order is the practice of retrospection, which you see among the ancients, especially with Pythagoras, as an examination, even a daily examination of going through the day and what could be done better, and where the next day can we repair the things that perhaps we did not do so good today. So as individuals, we are participating in our own study. We're participating in a very conscientious and deliberate self-examination for the purpose of self-perfection, which ultimately, in the way that we look at it, the goal of that is, of course, the evolution of the soul, and some might even say deification of the soul. The practice that we participate in is that at regular times, corresponding to certain astrological or astronomical dates, rather I should say astronomical, that there are regular times when we do more intently participate in that retrospective examination. And then, of course, as any esoteric order, we have our rituals that we participate in, both in groups and individually.
Okay. And the order, I believe, has three degrees.
That's correct. We have the serviteur degree, which is not an initiatic degree, although it can be if a person is located where there is a commandery of the Rose+Croix. That's what we call a chapter or a lodge of the Rose+Croix, either a commandery, or it can at times be called a priory. The serviteur, because a person can begin to participate in our work without being initiated, many of our members who are in other countries who have not been able to travel for initiation are serviteur. Then there's the initiatic grade of the écuyer or squire. And then, of course, there's the chevalier or knight, which also, because we are not exclusive in regard to sex, we have not only the knight but the dame.
In the in the rite of Memphis and Mizraim, I believe there's over 90 degrees, and in the Rose+Croix there's 3 degrees, and I believe most Martinist orders have 3 degrees as well. So what is the difference between those? Why, for example, would you need to go through 90 degrees as opposed to 3 degrees, or vice versa?
We have, for the Aesthetic Rosicrucian Order, 3 degrees primarily for the individuals who are not located where there's a commandery or priory, which is what we call a lodge of the ARC. They can attain the grade of servitor or servant. And this is not an initiatic degree. We do not initiate virtually or do self-initiation or anything like that. None of our groups do. However, we do permit individuals to begin participating in some of the work that we do and some of the studies that we do. And so most of our members actually are in the grade of servitor, because we have many people internationally who have been unable to travel and receive initiation yet. The initiatic grade of écuyer or squire is a grade beyond that, and then of course the person who attains the after a period of time and study and work, who wishes to go further, may attain the chevalier or dame degree, depending on whether they're male or female. Of course, we're not male exclusively. None of our groups are, by the way. And so those are our 3 degrees: servitor, écuyer, and chevalier or dame. And then beyond that, a person who is authorized to initiate others and lead a group may attain the commander.
Yeah. And yeah, so obviously we've had initiatic orders since really before recorded history, it would appear, or at least we've had initiations into the world of the divine and the world of spirits and so on, and the lineages that you represent go back 150 years, maybe a little bit more than that. Rosicrucianism has its origin actually in the early 1600s, without getting into the complicated windings of the history of Rosicrucian orders. But what do you see as being the purpose of initiatic orders today in our incredibly secular world, and a world that's becoming, in a way, more insular and more online and less about human interaction in person?
I do think that the group experience of initiatic orders is a fundamentally important one, not only in modern times, but throughout history, that the sense of a family of individuals studying together and working together who support each other is one of the most important things that we do. In fact, if you look to the Fama Fraternitatis, one of the original Rosicrucian documents, it discusses the unity and great secrecy and kindness toward one another that the Rosicrucians practiced. And so I do believe, especially these days, as we are experiencing so much isolation in our electronic world, that one of the things that these groups offer is a sense of community and people seeking others of like mind, especially when many of the ideas that we pursue are often scoffed at by those who may presume themselves to be superior in intelligence, but actually may be ignorant of some of the workings of nature. In another sense, I think that the initiatic heritage of these groups is something that for very, very long has been about, most fundamentally, about healing. It would be it would be a poor discussion on Rosicrucianism without bringing this up, that the Rosicrucian order is all about, in a way, all about curing the sick. And what we do outwardly to accomplish that, in whatever way, whether that is through medicine, whether that is through philosophy, whether that is just by being good men and women, that fundamental to initiation for us in any of our groups is the healing of suffering.
Right. Yeah. And would you say that art in the Aesthetic Rose+Croix, or art in general, can play a role in healing? Or
I certainly would. I think that this is something that in modern times, of course, we do see art therapies and music therapy. And maybe that's while I have great respect for those as fields, and so I don't mean anything otherwise by saying this, those are still maybe even superficial ways to look upon the role of art and music in healing. This is, of course, something that goes back to Plato and perhaps...
Yes. It would seem, at least with art and music, that it's the idea of creating something beautiful, or seeing something beautiful creates a kind of beautiful internal experience in the individual, whereas an ugly environment creates a kind of ugly personality as well.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. So where can people find out about the Aesthetic Rose+Croix or any of the other orders that you are involved with, or and perhaps more importantly, what kind of steps would you recommend someone takes before they even think about being initiated into an order?
I think the first steps that I would take if I had interest in a Rosicrucian order would be to read the three basic documents of Rosicrucianism, which are the Confessio, the Fama, and the Chemical Wedding. I think anyone who is interested in Rosicrucianism and perhaps even in Martinism should study these documents to understand them before anything.
Right.
I think questioning oneself as to one's purpose or motives is important, because I cannot speak for other orders, but at least in our groups and orders, if a person is joining in order to adopt a system or have someone take them hand in hand through conventicles or lessons, or just to go through a system of degrees for the sake of attaining degrees, I think that they would be disappointed. I think that these orders are more particularly for individuals who want to come together with other people of like mind, but who in the operations of their own laboratories or oratories are intent upon bringing God or the gods or deity into their homes and into their lives in regular practice. And so someone who would become a member of any of these groups should be preparing themselves for a regular participation in synchrony with nature at certain times of the year, at certain times of the month. Whether those relate to the solar cycle or the lunar cycle or the zodiacal calendar, we keep ourselves on a regular participation of bringing deity into our lives, into our homes, and into our groups.
Great. And so where can somebody get in contact with the Aesthetic Rose+Croix?
The best place, although there's not much information there, is the website of the Gnostic Church, which is apostolicgnosis.org. And at that website, there is a link to our initiatic affiliations. And the ones that are listed there are the Order Martiniste of North America and the Aesthetic Rose+Croix. So that's a good place to go.
Great.
To contact our group.
Excellent. Thanks very much. I appreciate you coming to speak with us.
Glad to be on with you.